O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art ever present, fill us all things, treasure of good things, and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from all impurity and save our souls with good one. Are you getting a lot of feedback from me? I'm getting like a repetition.
Sorry, say that again?
Are you getting feedback? I'm getting a lot of repetition, like it's echoing. And now I can't hear you. You're going to put it on mute. Gotcha. You're on mute. I can't hear you at all. That's good. Okay. Having passed through a small number of temptations, we'll begin our way. Having been consoled this past Sunday by the reality of God's work and the reminder of his mercy towards us in terms of our celebration of the precious and life-giving cross, which happened last Sunday, the church now, this coming Sunday, this Sunday that's coming up, calls us to return to the field of our souls and to labor for salvation. And it issues this call to return to the field of our souls, laboring for our salvation in a particular way. It calls us through a great figure of the church's history, St. John of Sinai, or St. John of the Ladder, as he is more commonly known. And tonight, with the little time that we have together, we're going to explore St. John's life in brief, highlighting several points which appear to be greatly didactic, which appear to be great lessons for us, before giving a little brief account as to why the Holy Fathers have determined that we ought to celebrate him on one of the Sundays in Lent. Now, what little is known of St. John's parentage or his birthplace, it is known that he was born somewhere around the year 525, and he lived until somewhere around 600, so about 75 years. He received a good education, as is evident from his writings, which he completed, we're told, by the age of 16. It was possible in his time to complete one's education fairly early because most teaching was done through private tutors, and thus it was begun early. Upon completion of his education, he immediately embraced the monastic life on Mount Sinai in Egypt, and here St. John put himself under obedience to a great elder named Martinius, who guided him in the monastic life for some 19 years. Now, during this early period of his monastic struggle, St. John once accompanied his elder to visit a renowned ascetic named St. John the Sabbath. This great ascetic immediately embraced the young John upon his arrival, and he washed his feet, ignoring the elder Martyrius. Now, this action scandalized many of the fathers that were present, but St. John the Sabbath simply responded to their scandalization, saying, "I don't know who the boy is, but today I have received the abbot of Sinai," prophesying that the young monk who had accompanied the elder would eventually be an abbot. Now, when John was 35, his elder Martyrius reposed, at which point he retreated deeper into the desert to an area known as Tholos, in order to live in greater isolation, far from the distractions of the world. John's renown grew during his time in Tholos, but as often occurs in the lives of the great saints of our church, some became jealous of him and began to criticize him for teaching. And St. John here takes an interesting tactic. Rather than fight with these people who criticize his teaching and cause scandal in the life of the church, St. John ceased from preaching for an entire year. So people criticized his teaching. Rather than argue with them out of humility, St. John ceased teaching for an entire year. Seeing his humility, however, his accusers eventually came to their senses and went to visit John, begging his forgiveness and asking him to return to the task of teaching. Now, St. John would pass the next 40 years of his life in the same blessed quietude until his repose, leaving only very occasionally. He would leave this solitude once to become abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, at which time some 600 pilgrims flooded the monastery to receive his spiritual advice. And this, brothers and sisters, is how we should be, running to get spiritual advice from the authentic bearers of the Orthodox tradition. So he becomes abbot, and on the first day, the day of his enthronement, 600 people come to speak to him. Now, he wouldn't remain here for long, however, as he soon began to desire the life of solitude again, and he once again retreats from the monastery to Tholos. Here, he would also make, from here, he would also make very occasional trips to Alexandria in order to visit a large Cenobitic monastery there. And he records some of his experiences at this monastery in his writings. So St. John, by this stage, has become a great teacher of the church. The question is, how did he do this? St. John became a teacher of others first, as a result of his having lived the Christian life himself, as a result of having absorbed it through his teachers and his experiences at monasteries. That is to say, he became a teacher through living experience. He learned how to battle sin by going to war with it, himself, and through speaking to those who had done likewise. As St. Gregory the theologian writes, it is necessary first to be purified and then to purify, to be made wise, then to make wise, to become light, then to enlighten, to approach God, and then to bring others to him, to be sanctified, and then to sanctify. To this first knowledge, however, St. John added a second, which made him an unqualified teacher of the Christian life. As the Vesperal hymn says, that we will hear this coming Saturday night, he ceaselessly studied the scriptures. This is what we'll hear on Lord, I Have Cried on Saturday night. O Holy Father John, truly hast thou ever carried on thy lips the praises of the Lord, and with great wisdom thou hast studied the words of Holy Scripture that teach us how to practice the ascetical life. So these two things, his experience gained through his own spiritual struggle and his deep study of the Holy Scriptures, culminated in people running to him in order to receive his spiritual advice. One particular instance of which has served to benefit the church across all the centuries. Sometime toward the end of St. John's life, an abbot of a nearby monastery wrote to him saying, now imagine the humility. An abbot condescends to write, and he asks, tell us in our ignorance, listen to how he speaks, an abbot, tell us in our ignorance everything you have learned by experience. Write it down in a book and send it to us. To which St. John replied in equal humility, I am still among the learners, but in obedience to your request, I will comply. What a beautiful exchange just in a few lines there. Tell us in our ignorance everything you have learned, but I am still a learner, but in obedience to your request, I will reply. The result is the book which is known to us as the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is composed of 30 chapters leading from the starting point of the Christian life to the greatest of the virtues, which he says is love. Now, just as St. John of Damascus synopsized the whole of the Orthodox Church's dogmatic teaching in his work, The Fountainhead of Knowledge, so St. John of the Ladder, or St. John of Sinai, did the same for the Christian spiritual life in his Ladder of Divine Ascent. Now, we don't have much in the way of time in order to detail the contents of this important work, but I would like us to take a look at a couple of important points from this work's opening chapter. So St. John opens the book with the following words that I want to read to you. This is what he says. Some are friends of God, some are his true servants, some are useless servants, some are entirely estranged, and there are some who, for all their weakness, take their stand against him. We simple people assume that his friends, O Holy Father, are properly speaking those intelligent and bodiless beings who surround him. His true servants are all those who have done and are doing his will without hesitation or pause. So his friends are the angels. His servants are those that do his will. His useless servants are those who think of themselves as having been worthy of the gift of baptism. but who have not at all guarded their covenant with him. Well, it seems to us, the strangers from God, his opponents are the unbelievers or the heretics. His enemies are those who not only contravene and repudiate the commands of the Lord, but make very stern war against all who obey him. Now, it's useful for us to consider where we are within this scale. And I think without a lot of assumption, most of us would likely readily admit that we are included amongst the useless servants. Now, what can we do to change this situation? If analyzing this ladder, we find ourselves grouped among the useless, what can we do to change it? This is what he says. Let us reach out our unworthy hand to the true servants of God, to those who devoutly urge us on and in faith compel us by their commands. So if we're a useless servant, what do? Let us reach out our unworthy hand to the true servants of God, to those who devoutly urge us on and in faith compel us by their commands. How do we make ourselves no longer useless servants? By finding guidance in our spiritual journey in the books of the Holy Fathers, but also in the true spiritual guides who have lived the faith truly and authentically. The simple way to put this, we need to schedule trips to the monasteries. We need to go and we need to ask advice. We need to make our confession. We need to talk about our spiritual problems and then try to implement the advice that these strugglers give to us. Now, the second point I want to make in the opening section of the ladder is connected to the first, as it has to do with what books we should turn to for guidance. Now, there are some modernist Orthodox, and I even hesitate to use the term Orthodox for these people, who try to tell us that we should not seek advice from the monastics, that the monastic life and the monastic books have nothing to offer us who are living in the world, that they are two totally different things. This, brothers and sisters, as you all know well, I don't need to remind you, is absolutely false. Absolutely false. And it is proven false by St. John of the Ladder on two fronts. First and foremost, by his life. Where did St. John seek counsel in order to learn how to live? Who remembers? What did it say in Vespers? With great wisdom thou hast studied the words of the Holy Scriptures that teach us how to practice the ascetical life. The Scriptures teach us how to practice the ascetical life. Do we not read these same Scriptures ourselves, seeking guidance for our own lives? Then what is the distance between us and the monastics? Not very great in this sense. Secondly, however, he answers it very directly in the opening chapters of the Ladder. He writes, some people, he says, living carelessly in the world, put a question to me. How can we who are married and living amid public cares aspire to the monastic life? Note what he says. Who asked him the question? Some people living carelessly. People who make this kind of argument within the context of the church, brothers and sisters, that the monastic life has nothing to do with the life in the world, are, according to St. John himself, trying to cover up their own laxity. They want an excuse not to obey the commandments on the level that the monastics show us. So St. John's answer is fundamentally that the monastic life and the life of the world only differ by degree. He writes, do whatever good you may. This is his answer to the person's question. Do whatever good you may. Speak evil of no one, rob no one, tell no lie, despise no one, and carry no hate. Do not separate yourself from the church assemblies. Show compassion to the needy. Do not be a cause of scandal to anyone. Stay away from the bed of another. and be satisfied with what your own wives can provide you. If you do all this, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven. So this all then proves true, that famous saying which is often attributed to St. John himself, that angels are light for the monastics, and that the monastics are light for the faithful. Let us then, brothers and sisters, search St. John's writings for guidance in our own attempt to live the cross, to live the Christian life, that we might all, through his prayers and guidance, shine together in the grace of the resurrection at Pascha. Amen.
Papa, is it okay if you get over the questions?
Sure.
So if anyone has a question, you gotta sit right here so Father John can.
If it's not related to this, I have another question.
Yep.
Would that be okay?
Yeah. But yeah, just come here so Father can.
Hello, Father, your blessing.
Lord bless you.
It's not related to your talk today, but I read something in the Bible the other day that has kind of stumped me. And if I could remember exactly what it was when God the Father spoke at the baptism of his son, and he said, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said, "Today I have begotten you." And my question is that we know Christ is eternally begotten without beginning or end. But when the Father speaks at that moment, he says, "Today I have begotten you." I'm just trying to figure out, is he meaning because when you're baptized, you are begotten in the human form as the dual nature of Christ being the human nature as opposed to the divinity of Christ? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're asking, and that's generally. I mean, Augustine, Blessed Augustine, when he's talking about all the sort of various interactions that occur between the voice of the Father in the presence of the Son in the New Testament, he says that we have to be careful to do that and distinguish. Okay, when is this a reference to a quality that refers to the Godhead and shows his unity with between Father and Son and their equality, and when is it something that's spoken to the humanity or referring to the humanity? And that's sort of what you're alluding to there. I think is that this statement is a statement that applies to the humanity of Christ. That makes sense to me in terms of what you're saying. I'd have to look again at that passage to be absolutely sure, because I just can't think in the top of my head what exactly the Father say about that line.
Okay.
What you're saying makes sense in terms of that basic principle, that some statements are made with respect to the humanity of Christ, and other statements are made with respect to showing the equality of the Father and Son.
Right.
So that would make sense to include that among lines that speak to the humanity of Christ.
So when the Father says, "Today I have begotten you," we know that Christ was begotten,
Before the ages.
Right. And so just my thinking was maybe the human part of Christ was begotten because we are made whole through baptism, and maybe that's showing the human nature needs to be baptized to have.
In the sense that we're begotten in the Father, it teaches us about the nature of baptism.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Christ in that sense doesn't require baptism.
Right. It was for our example, I guess.
His nature is from the outset, because he's been conceived apart from the normal manner of conception. His human nature doesn't carry the defect of the ancestral curse, and
right.
So he has no need for baptism in that sense. But he is baptized to teach us about baptism.
Thank you.
Papa, if possible, can you elaborate briefly when the issue of people living in the world and these questions posed to monastics, because we hear it a lot, especially during the fast periods, but in general, that, well, in Greek they'll say, what do you want to become a saint? And stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. No, sometimes I want to respond and say, no, diabolos. Like, I mean, I don't say anything, But can you just elaborate a little bit, because sometimes we even hear that, even amongst quote unquote Orthodox, that that's just too much. That, and I'm not trying to suggest there isn't place for discretion. I'm not trying to suggest that we don't sometimes can fall to the extremes on things, but the sense of the secularization of things.
Yeah.
Can you comment a little bit upon that? Are we living in the world and our responsibility to ourselves primarily and to others around us, seeking out proper guidance and living in the world?
Yeah, I think the question really comes back to, what is the matter? What is the medium, rather, that the saints and the fathers are working in? And it's the human soul. That's what their trade involves. The human soul is the same whether it's a monastic or a layman. And so the principles that are required in the intense living of the gospel that we find in monasticism are applicable to the life of the layperson, because the soul is the same human soul. A good spiritual guide will know how to qualify it. An experienced spiritual guide, a monastic, typically someone who has really lived the life to its fullest extent, will know very well how to apply that with discretion to someone who's living in the context of the world. We tend to be very easy on ourselves, and we will reduce it to the easiest possible thing to do. Whereas someone who actually has experience and knowledge of how the soul responds to particular situations, we'll put our feet to the fire and make sure that we do things properly.
Yeah, I think you said it very correctly, that we tend to be very light on ourselves and very hard on others. And I think that's where part of the struggle is that living in the world, especially these days, that where things have become even more diluted, more watered down, that even doing your cross in public is seen to be, oh, come on now, like that's just So what are some demarcation points for us to know whether the degree of worldliness in us and the degree where we're actually are falling into I hesitate to say the word fanaticism, but for lack of a better expression.
As Elder Epiphanius points out, there are theoacras. There are definitely the two extremes. I think the starting point is for us to realize that we generally tend towards the lowest extreme very heavily. So I almost barely ever use the word fanaticism, because I very rarely see it in terms of the living of individual spiritual lives, in terms of, if we're talking how I live or something like that. Makari, if only I saw more fanaticism in the spiritual life, and more in the good sense, in terms of a great zeal, in terms of really trying to live the commandments to their fullest. So I think that's really the start in terms of our war with secularity, is the realization that we are pulled extremely heavily to the other side, and to making arguments that make our own conduct somehow acceptable. So I think that's where we start, is just recognizing usually we're not even close to the other akvi. We're way on the underside of things.
Well, and I was going to comment on it earlier. I just didn't want to say anything, but I guess I will now. That, when you said, well, on Saturday night, you'll hear this in Vespers. Well, most of us don't go to Vespers, and most churches don't serve Vespers.
Yeah.
Right? And so that may seem like, back in the, as I joke around, with some of my friends, back in the old zealot days, we literally were running to go to different churches to go for Vesper services. And now, 20 some odd years later, we're happy to get to church for the gospel. Like we see from one, I will call it extreme, which is not, but one very hot temperature now to a very lukewarm, where it doesn't even bother us.
Yeah.
that we don't go to Vespers.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother us that we don't go to Orthros. It doesn't bother us that we are happy to get there. Oh, we heard the gospel today. Like, that was great.
Yeah.
How do we switch it back over to back to hot? And my root question, where this is coming from, is, and I say this to my kids sometimes, that I'm scared because I don't want God to allow something to happen, right, for us to have to go back to hot.
Yeah. I think a large chunk of it is willpower. I mean, to use the secular expression we hear all the time, sometimes, occasionally, fake it till you make it, I think is what they say. There's a level of acceptable hypocrisy, I think, within the Christian life, where we're always striving to an ideal that we haven't met. And so our heart may not always be in it. Our heart might not be pushing us to go to Vespers, for example. But if we push ourselves to go, the act of offering, of self-offering, of offering our will, at least, even if our heart isn't there, that gives God something to work with and something for His grace to rest upon, and give us the inspiration that maybe next time our heart becomes more warm towards the practice. So a large chunk of it is just getting ourselves to do it. And we all know what it's like, whether it be confession or going to Vespers or going to Orthros or whatever. We all know that little feeling of grace every once in a while when you do something good, even though it wasn't particularly easy for you to do. Or a vigil. The best example possible is a vigil. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not like this for you guys, and I hope I don't scandalize you. But I remember, particularly in Greece, when we lived in Thessaloniki, and there was a city there's a parish doing vigils, every week in Thessaloniki. Half the time I would go, I wasn't particularly enthused to go. I was a little bit sort of dreading it. But every time that feast ended, when you walked out of church into that air again, you felt like on top of the world. You felt like God was really with you again. And so I didn't offer very much going in. I just went because whatever. I felt, we'll speak secretly now. My wife wanted to go. And so Presbytera really wanted to go, and so Father John got drug along for the course. A little bit like St. Gregory of Nyssa. Does everyone know the story of St. Gregory of Nyssa with St. not St. Macrina? Who's his mother? St. Amelia. St. Amelia. She's going to have a vigil at her local church that she's built on the outskirts of their property. And of course, he's the brother of St. Basil, who's of course very zealous for his faith and things like that. St. Gregory of Nyssa in his youth wasn't particularly zealous. And so his mother sort of makes him go. And he goes and he sort of stands in church for a while. And then he leaves eventually, at one point he's in the narthex, and then eventually he's in the courtyard, and eventually he's asleep. In the context of this sleep, it was the 40 martyrs of Sevastia that we just celebrated. The 40 martyrs appeared to him and they beat him silly for his slackness. And he woke up and said, maybe this is a sign that I'm not supposed to be so lackadaisical with respect to my faith. And it was really a turning point in his life. The point being that, he got there and then God did something with him. And sometimes it's the same way for us. We need to get ourselves to get there. And then joy will come with that at a certain period of time. God will give us a little bit of grace for our self-offering, and that will give us the enthusiasm to persist. The other thing that's extremely valuable when it comes to Vespers and Matins is to really push ourselves to the recognition that these are the two teaching offices of the church. A large amount of theology and the lives of the saints we celebrate is learned through the hymns at Vespers and through the hymns at Matins, and hearing the Synaxarion read. Not just the abbreviated Synaxarion where they say, so-and-so died by the sword, so-and-so did. No, in the church, there were a Synaxarion passage read that gave you the life of the saint in the middle of Orthros. So between that Synaxarion and the hymns, and between Vespers and Matins, that's where a lot of theology can be learned. And so once we recognize that fact and we start paying attention to the hymns, there's even more incentive for us to be there and to take joy in what it is we're doing.
This is strangers like Papa. A lot of old faces haven't come on for a while, so
That's good.
yeah. So I'm buying a lottery ticket tonight.
You're trying them all out.
Old faces. Huh.
Ella Prokopi.
I thank you, Father. Your blessing.
The Lord bless you.
I have a question sort of pertaining back to fanaticism.
Mm-hmm.
I was volunteering with a group that does peer counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And they apparently, or sadly, have bought into the 53 gender universe.
Mm-hmm.
So one person there was identifying me as what they call cis, which means
Yeah,
like,
I've heard that.
So I put up my hand. I said, "Excuse me, no, I respect your struggle,
Yeah.
but you spent your whole life fighting against people calling you names you didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
So what gives you the right to do that to me now?"
Yeah.
So apparently, I'm a secular heretic, and I've been banned.
Yeah.
So, like, to me,
God bless you.
that wasn't going too far. Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
God bless you. That's, I mean, we suffer for righteousness' sake. That's okay. And all we're doing there is putting hypocrisy.
I don't consider myself suffering. So no, sorry. I just didn't know if that was like. I don't know. I just.
I think that's one of the reasons where we've gotten to where we are is in not asserting at the very least that some of those rights do go both ways.
Yeah.
You know,
well,
there's sort of an assumption that Christianity has to lay down and not defend itself at all. Some of those rights do go both ways.
I generally say when your charter rights bump up against our charter rights or my charter rights, then we have to agree to disagree and walk away.
Sure.
You know, as far as like secular society and the rendering unto Caesar, that we just you have to walk away.
Yeah, it's getting more complicated that way. It's getting more complicated that way. It's like I've mentioned it before that, for example, when you read Saint Hippolytus, who's very early, a pope of the Church of Rome, early 2nd century. Saint Hippolytus is very, very against Christians holding secular office, obviously because he exists in the pre-Constantinian period. And to hold secular office meant that you were going to have to burn incense to the idols and those types of things, or at least make some compromise with respect to your faith. And I have to admit, Prokopi, there are days now where I'm starting to wonder if maybe we're headed back in the direction where we're getting very close to having to be very careful with what we're involved in.
Yeah, I think it's important to be out in the community, but if it's going to harm you.
That's it. And we also have to do, we can't throw our hands up. We have to do good where we can do good. And there still are places for us to do good now.
My favorite is talking to strangers on the subway.
That's good.
And watching the creative ways they ignore people. Thank you, Father.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Evoluite, Father.
Bless you.
I have a question. You mentioned grace.
Mm-hmm.
I would really like for you to talk more about that, about being at a service and feeling elevated somewhat. Like you feel that extreme joy and you just never want it to end ever. Like literally,
my life would look a lot better if I never wanted it to end.
Yeah. But to talk about, can you talk about God's grace? Maybe I should be more specific with my question. Forgive me, but just about that grace that comes to us.
Papa, can I politely interject?
Please.
I think what Linda's hitting at, and maybe it links back to what I was saying earlier, is that sometimes we lack zeal because we lack understanding what is God's grace, right? You know, you may see somebody performing a certain act, whatever it may be. Let's say they're a sports player or they're a hairstylist or something, and you see that person, they're doing it with they're flowing at it. You see there's joy in what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So in the spiritual realm, we look at the saints, and Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios, the recent saints, that they obviously had a lot of zeal, a lot of love for God because of a lot of grace. So there's a direct link between those two.
Yeah.
I think that's what.
And is it okay to seek it also, or is that a bad thing? Like, for example, I ask to feel that. Like when I am at church, if I'm not feeling, I'm like, but I need someone to help me. I want to be present. I want to feel that. Should we just let it happen, or ask for it to happen?
I think it's better for us to just let things unroll as God sees best for us. Because sometimes it's not always best for us to have experiences like that. It's like love in a relationship. When we're in a relationship with someone, the true test of the fortitude of that relationship and the strength of that relationship is the perseverance within it, even when things aren't easy. And sometimes God, in order to grow our faith and make us more firm, will allow us to quite deliberately to pass through times where we don't feel great amounts of grace in terms of the types of experiences we normally associate with it. Really, I think more what has to be our focus is remembering it in those moments where it does come to us rather than seeking it out. Because God obviously has his reasons when it isn't there for us in the same way. More important is for us to remember, when we've had it, keep that memory vivid and giving thanks for it and striving to make ourselves worthy of it again, kind of thing. Because we know, without going into a lot of detail and opening up a whole new parenthesis somewhere, we know there is such thing as delusion, and it can happen to us that if we seek a lot of spiritual experiences, the demons can certainly exploit that and give us things. If I become expectant on light and the demons start to know that, they can feed this light. And then, it starts out as something that feels good, and eventually they start slipping falsity into it. So we do have to be very careful in terms of praying for and looking for experiences. Are those experiences part of the Christian life? Yes. Are they sort of verifications of God's presence and his love towards us at various moments? Yes. But in his providence, he bestows them when we need them and when they're useful, more importantly, for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Kalo Pascha.
Pieces.
Anyone else? I'm buying 2 lottery tickets because Fanny has not asked the question. She must be having a very good Lent.
You just disturbed her. She was saying the prayer. You should have left her alone.
Anyone? Okay, Papa, thank you so much for spending time with us. Before we let you go, can you just read again that advice St. John gives to us living in the world?
If I can find it. Okay. So, of course, it starts off with some people living carelessly in the world put a question to me. How can we who are married and living amid public cares aspire to the monastic life? I answered, do whatever good you may, speak evil of no one, rob no one, tell no lie, despise no one, carry no hate. Do not separate yourself from the church assemblies. Show compassion to the needy. Do not be a cause of scandal to anyone. Stay away from the bed of another and be satisfied with what your own wives can provide you. If you do all this, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven. Amen.
Amen. We ask for your closing prayers, Papa.
O Christ, the true light which illumines and sanctifies every man who comes into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may behold the light unapproachable. Guide our footsteps aright to the keeping of thy commandments, through the intercessions of thine all immaculate mother, of our holy and God-bearing Father Simeon the new theologian, and of all the saints. Have mercy on us and save us, for as much as he is good and loveth mankind. Amen.
Amen. Karinita Papa, thanks again.
Karinita.
Thank you.